Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone joining from coast to coast to coast. My name is Larry Innes. I'm one of the research leads with the Conservationist Reconciliation Project out of the University of Guelph, partner at Althea's Claire Townsend, and so far your solo facilitator for today's panel. Today, we're going to be talking about private land conservation and the intersection of private land conservation with Indigenous rights. This webinar is one of a series, a virtual campfire series that the Conservationist Reconciliation Partnership hosts. And I'm joining you today from beautiful downtown Samba Cay, also known as Yellowknife, in the Chief Dry Geese Territory of Treaty 8 in the Northwest Territories. My panelists will introduce themselves. First, I'm going to turn over the event to my colleague, Patricia Solis from the Maliseet Nation Conservation Council in Wolastoqey Territory to open this webinar in a good way. Over to you, Patty.
Well, Ewan, Larry, Quay to everyone that is on this webinar today. It is a great honor to do and offer a small opening, virtual opening to this. And I just wanted to say, Nilda Louise, Patricia Solis. My name is Patricia Solis. I am from Nugutguk, or otherwise known as Tobic First Nation in New Brunswick. And I would also like to say, Waliwan, Giziolinik, Waliwan, Musam Sanuk, Nokmis Sanuk. Thank you, Creator. Thank you, grandmothers and grandfathers, for giving us this day and this opportunity to come together, and wish everyone a great session, and for our good minds and our good hearts to be brought together in a good way so that we can have some great time discussing what we need to discuss. Waliwan.
Waliwan, Patty. And what I'd like to do is turn to a brief introduction to the issues that we'll be discussing today, and then to our first panelist, Dr. John Burrows. So briefly, this webinar is one of the projects of Virtual Campfire held by the Conservationist Reconciliation Partnership, which is a unique SSHRC-funded research partnership grant involving academics, practitioners, Indigenous nations, NGOs, public governments, and private citizens in exploring how conservation as a concept that largely flows from Western traditions of setting aside land for particular purposes intersects with Indigenous ideas which are broadly similar or not to that concept. One of the challenges that has become obvious to many practitioners in the area of conservation is that there's an assumption that private land is in fact not subject to the duties of respect, reciprocity, and legal obligation that arise for public governments in relation to decisions affecting Indigenous lands and rights within Canada. Ian Attridge and I, Ian has now joined us, were retained through the CRP partnership to co-lead a study and co-authored a study in which we explored the ideas of respect and responsibility in relation to private land conservation and Indigenous rights and governance over lands in Canada. That report is available on the CRP website. We're not going to discuss it in great length here, but we are very honored to have with us practitioners who are at different corners, if you will, of the question. And we'll begin today with Dr. John Burrows, who is, as I'm sure many of you know, one of Canada's leading thinkers about rights and responsibilities for both Indigenous and public governments. And without further ado, John, I'll turn the mic over to you.
Miigwech. Buju ni dinoe maganidok, ni jinishnabeg ni jimarzig, giganos indigenicas, neashi winigaming and donjaba, nigigin dodem. I'm really grateful to be able to join with you today. I'm speaking from the Lekwungen speaking peoples territory and the Wisanich territory here in the south end of Vancouver Island. And this idea that we're exploring here of trust is so important. It has obviously many dimensions. If you think about trust as a way that you would live in trying to create relationships that are open and transparent and nurturing and nourishing, that allow for us to live with a degree of understanding with one another. There's certainly a lot to say in that regard. And then, of course, you can think about trust in a legal context, which this report does. And when you think about trust in that regard, there are obligations that we would find to ensure that there's a continuity of some interest, some feature, some relationship through time that, again, is held to really strong duties of utmost faith and loyalty. And so, these issues that we're talking about today have to do with putting land in trust such that there's a sustainability to that land, and there's exclusions as to what can be done with that land. A trust is often there in the conservation context to keep it from some industrial activities, whether it be mining or oil and gas or mineral extraction, but there could be other clauses that would be there to ensure that there's not an encroachment on that land. One of the challenges we found, and this is what the report talks about, is often Indigenous jurisdiction, Indigenous people's own law, Indigenous people's own relationships are not taken account of in the setting up of these trusts. As wonderful as they might be in many contexts, it's as if Indigenous peoples weren't there, are not there when these trusts are created. And that's a challenge that this report addresses, that we are hopefully addressing today. But I want to sort of take you down a third layer. So we've talked about trust is just a way to live in the world with one another, and an aspiration that we might have to live well. There's this legal concepts of trust, but then there's also these Indigenous concepts of trusts. And I remember learning from Basil Johnson, one of the elders from our community at the Chippewa, the Nawash, or Neashi Winigaming First Nation on the shores of Georgian Bay, about 3 hours north of Toronto. He said that it's not just the case that we have a responsibility to the earth, but the earth also looks after us. And in some ways, we are the beneficiaries of a trust as human beings. And how do we live in relationship with one another to understand that we are those beneficiaries? And I'm just going to read a short excerpt from Basil's book called Ojibwe Heritage. He published it in 1976. And it's about 2 or 3 paragraphs here, which is the principle of equal entitlement. After he talks about the earth's bounty and the mantle of the earth and all that it provides for us, precludes private ownership. No man can own his mother. The principle extends even into the future. The unborn are entitled to the largesse of the earth, no less than the living. During life, a person is but a trustee of a portion of land and must pass on to children what was inherited from our mother, the earth, Shkamikwe. At death, the dying leave behind the mantle they occupied, take nothing with them but a memory and a place for others to come. Such is our legacy as humankind: to come, to live, to go, to receive in order to pass on. No one can possess our mother, the earth. No one can own the earth. And so that's an interesting concept, right? That the idea of ownership itself has some challenges within Indigenous law because we're just passing through, but as we're passing through, we have these duties to care. But it goes further. As we linger and pass on, Mother Earth remains enduring. With death ends the ownership and possession. We do not outlive the earth. The earth outlives us, outlasts us. And then here's the point I really want to make. As beneficiaries of their mother's care and love, children are obligated to look after their mother in illness and decrepitude. So the point here is that we have obligations as humans because of what we receive from the earth, and we are in the care of the earth. It's not just us creating stewardship, conservation, easements, protected areas for the earth. The earth does that for us. And our striving is to understand that and then to live in relationship to that. And unfortunately, we've had a property law and a common law and a trust law, equity law regime that has prevented some of those Indigenous conceptions of relationship, of law, of jurisdiction, and not just human jurisdiction, earth jurisdiction, the earth speaking to us. Juris is law, diction is to speak. We often think about jurisdiction as like I'm speaking my law about federal power or provincial power. But what if the earth is speaking to us? There's a voices that are found in our winds and waves and waters and birds and plants and animals. And there's ways to listen to those voices, that diction that's there that has a different kind of vocabulary, but nevertheless through stories, language, science, our teachings, there's a way to think about law in relationship to that diction that's coming to us from the earth. And so I'm really appreciative of this report and the work of Larry and Ian and Skeena, one of our amazing students, Skeena Lawson, one of our fantastic students at the University of Victoria, who's in our joint Indigenous law, common law degree. This report points us towards these possibilities of Indigenous jurisdiction, Indigenous ethical spaces, and thinking about how we work with these ideas of trust and conservation and protection areas in patterns that invite us to listen differently to one another and listen to the earth, and then start to arrange our affairs in relationship to the earth, right? The idea is there's no reconciliation with one another ultimately until we are reconciled with the earth, right? And what Larry and Ian and Skeena and the Nature Conservancy and the researchers here at Guelph University are doing is trying to think about how in these layered ways we can be brought into better relations in this regard. So hopefully that's a little bit of an introduction and help as we begin our discussion today.
Masi, John, and I think that's such a good opening to the discussion. I'm conscious of your time and that you've only got about 10 minutes left with us this morning. I'm wondering if there is a question from either one of the panel or from the larger audience that perhaps picks up on your key thread, which is how we restore relationships. And I'll stop talking, and hopefully someone will jump in with a question.
So I see one of the questions is the book I'm citing, and it's called Ojibwe Ceremonies, and it's by Basil Johnson. I think he's written 25 books. There's about 18 in English, and the rest are in Anishinaabe, including a fantastic thesaurus that really takes you into the details of the language in terms of the verb-based nature of Anishinaabemowin and many Algonquian languages. And if we think of our relationships with the earth in that verb orientation, right, that it's something we do, it's not just a categorization of trust, not just a noun of kind of property. It is something that brings us into sort of a conjugation, as it were, that is a way in time and place and space we can see ourselves as a part of, as opposed to being separate from these beautiful ancestors that we live amongst when we think about the more than human world that's a part of us and we're a part of.
And in fact, that premise takes us into a three-way dialogue, not just between those who are drawing the line and setting aside land with those who've had relationships with the land, but with the land itself. There's another question. Perhaps, John, you can take that as the final one before you depart.
Okay, I think are there two concepts, one of private property and the other of responsibility, just totally incompatible? How can they be reconciled? I wouldn't say totally incompatible. I think things exist along a spectrum, and there are places in the middle of the spectrum between responsibility and ownership where you might find meeting points and reconciliation points and possibilities for translation and dialogue and mutual elucidation and helping us see more fully what our possibilities are in that place. But as you move down the spectrum, there can be things that you find would be incompatible with one another. And we need to keep our eye on that possibility of spectrum. I've often said, beware the danger of a single story, which is to say that it's likely at some instances there's an incompatibility, but many instances there's a point of meeting, as this report talks about in wonderful terms. Another thing I often say is nuance is sacred. And we had to enter into these spaces recognizing that nuance is a part of the way that we are living with the earth and the waters and all of those beauties and people with their different ideas around us. It's important to take, I think, those perspectives while not dropping the idea that sometimes things can be diametrically there are dichotomies, right? There are polarities, and at the end of those polarities, some of those things can be quite unable to be matched to one another. And so it's to keep all of this in our conversation, recognizing the moments of non-engagement and refusal, at the same time recognizing there are other dimensions to the ways that we can come up beside one another and live in linking arms together, as our treaties talk about, or with those two-row wampum teachings of peace and friendship and respect, even though there's two separate rivers of life on those wampum belts, citing our earlier treaties. So I really appreciate the question, because it gives me an opportunity to try to lean into the complexities of what we're talking about and not being scared by them, recognizing both the, or all of the, rather than both of the, all of the issues that we're dealing with here. So thank you for that.
Yeah, Shnaskimit, John, that's a great segue to our next panelist, Patricia Solis, who's in many ways living in that moment you've described, where in the New Brunswick, Wolastoqey context, there is a moment right now which is fraught with tension, which is fraught with one side speaking in imperatives of this must only be one way. And that's being met by Patty, who I know to be a gentle warrior with a different vision. And maybe Patty, I'll let you pick up the thread from there.
Miigwech, John. It's good to see you, and it's good to hear you as always. And so many of your words are very powerful and really help all of us who want to and need to speak to, all of these teachings and understandings that guide so much of the work that we do. And to me, I guess in the context within which I'm working, it is about balancing. It is about balancing reciprocity with responsibility, with compassion and passion and understanding and care for our lands, for our waters, for our relatives. And so, here where we are, yes, there is some level of tension, some level of conflict, let's say, in views that are being expressed that are, I guess, being portrayed in a very black and white fashion. And as we all know, especially with the current circumstance that we are all in, which is our health situation, the pandemic, that there is the need for reaction. There is the need to take action. And in doing so, in working towards balancing better between reciprocity and responsibility, I think we get to a point where we're talking even beyond conservation to a level of stewardship that we can all work with. And to me, that's an essence of what we come down to in terms of our teachings, is not taking more than what you need. And when we look at that, in a broader sense, not taking more than what we need has many implications. And when we relate it to private land acquisition, this is very key. This is a very key understanding, and it is really an opportunity for us in Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship work to take a leadership role so that folks, as many of our prophecies have said, folks will be looking to us as the Indigenous nations across Turtle Island, across the globe, so that we can provide, our leadership, our type of leadership to our fellow human beings, and really on behalf of the natural world, which we are all related to. So, we've been working hard over the past number of years to address many issues around this idea of ownership, reclamation, to the point now where we are broaching really land back. And as we know, these are critical concepts that need to be shared and need to be understood in a way that is not, really built upon the fear mongering. Let's say that certain folks in leadership roles have undertaken, particularly here in this jurisdiction, that we need to get and move beyond that, because as the report that Larry and Ian and Skeena did, it's speaking to looking at the truth before the reconciliation. And so this is very important work to us. So we'll leave and Larry for this bit of an opportunity to share about our work.
Thanks, Patty. And I'm going to introduce now Ian Attridge, who is one of the co-authors of our report. Ian's a professor at Trent and a practitioner in the area of land trusts, and he's going to transition now to a conversation with Nathan Cardinal.
Thanks very much, Larry, and it's a pleasure to join you. Sorry for some of the technical difficulties early. I'm joining from the territory, the Williams Treaty First Nations territory, and it's Treaty 20 and the Williams Treaty areas of the Mississauga and Anishinaabeg. And I'm delighted to be in this territory and to really recognize at this transition time of the year how wonderful it is. And lots of transitions on the West Coast as well. And I wanted to introduce Nathan Cardinal, who's been involved with Indigenous relations with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. And NCC has been very supportive of the work at the Conservation Through Reconciliation Partnership, and also into support for the research paper that Larry Skeena and I worked on. So passing that on to Nathan for a bit of an introduction to the topic and yourself and some of the work of NCC. Nathan.
Thanks so much, Ian, for the introduction, and thanks so much for all the other panelists and you and Larry for all your work and your words and wisdom and perspective today. I think and it's through conversations like this that we really have opportunities to kind of listen and learn, I think, which is really, really critical for organizations that are working in around private land conservation and trying to do what they can to change, I think, what our contemporary understanding of conservation is to something that I think reflects more of that idea about prosperity and well-being. And John, I really appreciate those words you shared about no man can, no man, no person, no individual, no organization can own their mother, and that we are all really in some way trustees upon this earth. And I think that's really important. And it just, as well, I just really want to acknowledge that I'm on the traditional territory of the Wasanich and Hulkaminam people, and in what's now known as Southwestern BC. And I really hold my hands up to those nations that have really worked for millennia to take care and steward the land. And that's right all across what is now known as Canada as well too. And I think when NCC was established about nearly 60 years ago, my guess is that the original men that started the organization thought very little, if at all, about Indigenous connections to the land or Indigenous rights or the responsibilities that First Nations people in the region where the organization was first established, that the responsibilities they had to the land around them. And at the same time, I think NCC, like many other conservation organizations in Canada, and particularly when I think about private land, really benefited, I think, from the legacy of persecution of Indigenous peoples in Canada. And whether that's, thinking about things like the Indian Act and the reservation systems, or the imposition of title systems that replaced and broke down to some degree Indigenous governance and legal systems and knowledge systems that created this space for organizations that really trying to do meaningful work to conserve and steward land and be trustees to the world around us and future generations, really benefited from that dispossession that affected Indigenous people so deeply. My family too, my family's Métis, my family comes from Northern Alberta. And I think part of the thing that drives me today is that, my father and his family were all longtime stewards and caretakers of the lands that they hunted and trapped on, and the relationships and responsibilities that they held. And today I see the work that I do in supporting NCC or working with other conservation organizations as a modern interpretation of that responsibility. And that at the heart is what brings me to be part of this panel today, is the belief that collectively we can do better, and through respecting and providing support for Indigenous leadership, as what Patty was speaking about, that we can collectively realize a better future and a better prosperity and well-being for the world around us. And so I think for NCC, it's like many organizations these days, has really kind of come to that realization that you and Larry identified in the report, that there's no principled basis for anyone involved in private land conservation to operate as though Indigenous governments don't have a role or a say in private land. And so NCC, I think, has really been trying to do change its practices over the last number of years, and really thinking about what does that mean when it comes to private land conservation, and really trying to take steps to improve our understanding and start to change its practices to take a more principled and respectful approach to conservation, which is really, I think, wanting to make sure that the support that it can provide for Indigenous leadership is central and fundamental to what the organization does. I think we definitely realize that this isn't easy, and that I think oftentimes when we dig into these things that we can unearth or uncover or explore even more challenging questions than when we looked at the surface. But I think when we realize that the importance of that, when we realize that the rights that Indigenous nations have, that the sovereignty that they have, the self-determination that they have, the long-standing stewardship that they continue to maintain, will only result in more positive, more enduring conservation that really speaks to improved health and well-being for human and non-human relations. That there really, at that point, there really is no going back. And so now it's not a matter of if we will see change and if we will see how private land conservation can better support and respect Indigenous sovereignty and rights, and it's a matter of when. And I think it's also a matter of how. And I think through that realization about that being able to listen and learn and be able to participate in conversations like this is really where we will get to learn. And as private land organizations like NCC, it's an opportunity to learn how we can support that leadership, how can we can support that recentering of things like private property practices, how do we recenter conversations and understanding of what private land or conservation is, and that we're able to support new ways of, I think, prosperity and well-being as we kind of go forward, and I think help to reorient that those relationships and that idea of trust so much that that John was talking about earlier. So it's no matter a thing for leading in conservation, but how do we support the leadership of Indigenous nations and communities and individuals to conserve and steward their territories in a way that's meaningful for them, through which we all have a benefit. So I'll just stop there and invite further questions. And thanks so much again to everyone else that's on the panel today.
Good, Nathan, and yeah, seeing some of the themes of leadership, of that leadership of listening and learning, as you mentioned, and the journey that NCC has gone through, and that NCC is helping bring to these conversations and the paper, and I appreciate that sharing and your ongoing support in these initiatives. Really delighted to have Kelsey join us here, Kelsey Ruizma, and she's a consultation manager with the Wolastoqey Nation, and would really appreciate your reflections on the journey that brings you to this conversation, some of the challenges or insights that you're starting to see as we start to get into this conversation. Kelsey.
Sure. I've just been really absorbed, and I was listening and forgot I also have to speak. Hello. I mean, thank you for the intro. I'm, really excited to be a part of this panel today. This report, I don't think I've ever been more grateful for something in my work, in my life. I work really closely with Larry, and a lot of the issues that this report addresses were, weekly conversations I was having. How do I move us forward in these relationships? So I'm the consultation manager, but my background is in conservation, and I also lead the conservation files for us. And, when trying to build those relationships, particularly with private land organizations, I kept running into these issues of, that's not our job, or that's not our responsibility. This isn't public land. I don't know. It seems quite simple to me, all of the land was stolen, and it doesn't matter if it's public or private land. And so there is that huge responsibility, but it's like, where's the law, and how do we get these organizations past that fear? Because for me, I've had really polarizing experiences with private land organizations. So I've had, a really great experience where the organization, is all about land back, and they were grateful to work with us, which is not the norm. And then I've had a lot of conversations, I think, that's fueled by the fear mongering that Patricia brought up in our particular context in New Brunswick, that, doesn't really have any grounds in truth. And so it's really hard to talk about those things and, assure organizations moving forward that a lot of those fears are unfounded, and that's, not what we're looking at. And so I think that that's been the main challenge. But I really do think with this report and being open and honest about fears, and, kind of having those vulnerable moments to develop relationships, I think there's so many opportunities that can be had with, private land conservation groups and Indigenous nations. Yeah, that's all I have right now.
Thanks, Kelsey. And I think we'll have an opportunity in our discussion to really dive into some of those challenges and some of the opportunities that real hard conversations between private land conservationists and land trusts and Indigenous peoples and their governments in our dialogue. But we have Megan Padalino, who's with us from the Unamaki Institute of Natural Resources in Mi'kmaq. She's also working with the Confederacy of the Mainland Mi'kmaq Eskasoni Fish and Wildlife Commission, and is their Indigenous Protected Area and Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area specialist. So Megan, you're working on the ground on solutions. Welcome to the panel, and we're all ears.
Yeah, Gwei, hello, hi. Yeah, so my name is Megan, and I just want to say how honored I am to be included in this panel. I, like you, Kelsey, was just kind of sitting here just in awe of the knowledge and insight being shared. And it's like, oh, right, I also have to try and add to that. And I don't know if I really could say anything better. I don't think I'm as eloquent with my words. But yeah, I do want to start off by saying that I am of settler descent. So in my role, I am supporting the Mi'kmaq Nation in working on private land conservation specifically. But I do think that's really important to say up front, is that as a settler, that is my job, is to provide the support. I'm not here to make decisions. I'm not, that's not my role. It's Mi'kmaq led. It's not settler led, which is really important. So in that role, we've really excited that we in Nova Scotia were able to actually create a Mi'kmaq-led land trust. So trying to kind of look at this current private land paradox that we're in and trying to make it Mi'kmaq-led. So in Nova Scotia, it's really interesting. We actually have about 65% of Nova Scotia considered private lands. And of course, I say that with quotations because land shouldn't be private and not. So that's kind of the report that we're talking about. It's so important to our work here because we do have such a weird land tenure and there is a lot of opportunity there. But it's also a really exciting opportunity because when you are looking at these quote unquote private lands, there's a lot more, or I see a lot more potential. If we're able to actually bring these lands back to the Mi'kmaq, it really opens up the opportunities. And it's that idea, Nathan, you were talking about conservation. It's a very Western idea of keeping land away from the people, but in reality, people are part of the land. They're part of the land, the water, and the air. And we have to look at it as a whole system and really using that two-eyed seeing approach, looking at it from a Western knowledge system, but also from an Indigenous knowledge system, and being able to kind of find the strengths in both of those systems to really propel these conversations and these goals and values forward. So I don't want to say too much more just because, again, everyone has been already shared so much and I want to leave time for some questions. But again, thank you so much for having me and I'm really excited for this conversation.
Thanks, Megan, and exciting to hear of that news of the land trust and the insights that's drawing from Mi'kmaq elders that are being applied and woven into your community. And coming back to some of the comments that John had mentioned about, and I think Patty as well, that stewardship concept of how to engage people with the land, and really appreciate your sharing on that part. We want to move some of our questions along to some of the impacts of private land conservation on Indigenous rights and title across Turtle Island, and also how do we set up systems or practices to reconcile dominant concepts of private ownership and Indigenous knowledge systems. I know, Megan, you just spoke about the two-eyed seeing and bringing those insights and Indigenous knowledge systems to the fore is really important. Some of the ideas that we've heard already in our conversation about Indigenous protected and conserved areas, or Indigenous-led land trusts, and other forms of Indigenous-led conservation can be a solution. And I'm wondering, there was a question here also for Nathan around a land trust, a conservation land trust, acquiring some lands and wanting to work with the local First Nations. And I'm wondering whether some of those challenges, the reconciliation of those concepts and how land trusts might be able to be, as one person had asked earlier, perhaps a midpoint on that spectrum that John was originally talking about. So thoughts about land trust roles and encouraging those healthy and respectful relationships with Indigenous nations.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Yeah, and I think there's lots that land trusts can be able to, I think, explore when it comes to that question, and being able to support the rights and responsibilities of nations, as you know, as folks have been talking about too, across traditional territories, whether that's what we call private land these days, or crown land, or otherwise. I think a lot of the time, one of the first steps I always think about is the requirement to educate ourselves about the Indigenous histories within what is now known as Canada. I think educating ourselves upon the history of conservation, and really undertaking some of those questions that we should be asking ourselves about whose land is it, and then I think the questions about we should ask ourselves. I think fellow Peter Forbes, who I had some chats with as well the other day, was question about, we should ask ourselves, what is conservation and who is it for? And I think those are really fundamental things that we really should be thinking about when we do our work. And so we as land trusts, I think, are able to ask that question and be able to work in this space where we think about private land conservation, and we can think about what do we mean when we talk about conservation, and really who is it for? And I think, as I think Megan, you were talking about there a moment ago, like oftentimes people will show me photos of a pristine landscape, and I mean these places look great, they're really beautiful, but they're always missing people. And I think that idea about Indigenous peoples as being the continuing stewards and caretakers with the rights and responsibilities to do that work, that are fundamental to the health and well-being of these landscapes. And these so-called pristine landscapes are really missing that fundamental component. And so what can we do as land trusts to be able to, I think, support those responsibilities and those connections? And I think that can take a whole range of things, whether that's using existing tools that land trusts have, where they're, you know, working to acquire title or things less than title and work to transfer those back to nations, to be able to work in co-management or co-governance. I think there's lots of work these days too, that where organizations like NCC can, I think, help address some of those barriers that also exist out there, whether that is thinking about sometimes development tenures or mineral tenures, and how can that support and remove those things to where that allow nations then to be able to go in and conserve lands in ways that are kind of relevant to them and are meaningful to them. Or being able, as land trusts that have done lots of conservation work, are there opportunities to share knowledge and learnings that we had in this kind of Western approaches to conservation as an interim step, I think, as nations realize and actualize their sovereignty and governance systems across their traditional lands. So I think there's different things that organizations like NCC can do. I think it really starts with educating ourselves. I think the other real opportunity that organizations like NCC have is being able to help raise that awareness across others too. So whether that is communicating with donors and funders and foundations, and at kind of that societal level, how do we help, I think, talk about that truth, that raise that awareness to people that own private land or have the ability to enact change on private land, and work to kind of create that collective and that have that dialogue, much as like we're having today with others, to be able to move that conversation forward. So that's, I think, a really great opportunity. And then I think the opportunity to kind of work and enable new ways of thinking is really, really important. So, I always think right now we work within this box of laws and legislation, whether that's like charity laws or tax laws. And what can we do as an organization to highlight the barriers that those things create for Indigenous nations and communities to enact their own ways of governance and approaches to conservation these days? And how do we be able to help change those systemic challenges that we have? And I think that's another role that organizations like NCC can play. I think fundamentally, at the end of the day, it's about reorienting that question about what is conservation and who is it for. And it comes to a place of, how do we support the leadership of nations to achieve what they want to see on the land? What does that relationship between human and non-human relations look like? And how do we be able to take our skills and abilities to support that leadership and envision, I think, a much more holistic relationship with the land, like John was talking about earlier.
That's a great and fulsome answer, Nathan. Thanks for laying that out. I think one thing that kind of strikes me as a point of further development is the idea of Indigenous land trusts. And I see a number of questions now in the chat that are asking, so what are these things, and how do I get one? Those are questions that we undertake to a certain degree in our report, but also very conscious that Megan, Patricia, and Kelsey are all deeply involved in various aspects of this. So I wanted to provide them an opportunity to talk a little bit about the work in their contexts and how they see Indigenous land trusts fitting in as a relatively new feature on the landscape.
I guess I can start if neither of you two are going to jump at it. Again, speaking just specifically from my experience helping to support the Mi'kmaq and the establishment of Sespidade Eminage New Conservancy, I did see there was also a question in the chat there about other Indigenous land trusts, and I just thought I would mention. So there is Sespidade Eminage New Conservancy in what is now present day Nova Scotia. There's also Walpole Island Land Trust, which is in Walpole Island, Ontario, and there is another land trust in New Brunswick, and I apologize, I cannot pronounce the name. So there are Indigenous land trusts currently being developed, established across Canada. And I think it's important to note in that, though, is that when we're talking about this and this in the context of private land conservation, it's not to say that land trusts are the ultimate answer to private land conservation. They're just currently a tool that we are able to use and that we're able to manipulate so it can at least incorporate some level of Indigenous values and ways of knowing. So in saying that, again, kind of looking at the example here in Nova Scotia with our Conservancy here, we're really lucky in that we're part of a bigger collaborative project, and that's where our funding comes from through the Challenge Fund and the province and federal government. So we have had some really great support in creating this land trust. But in saying that is where, like I've said, we're trying to see how can we incorporate Mi'kmaq values into it? How can we make it so it really is Mi'kmaq led? And of course, there's unfortunately a lot of procedural and legal aspects that we cannot change, not easily. But there are aspects that we are making kind of fit what we're looking at. So we have made sure that the board of directors that is leading this Conservancy is Mi'kmaq led, and that all 13 communities within Nova Scotia are at that table and are able to be involved in the decisions and the conversations that we're having. And we've also are working on, and this ties into another question I think was asked as well, is that sorry, I'm jumping around here, but so the whole idea of private land and that land shouldn't be owned. So we've made sure that we're really deliberate in the language that we use. So our mission statement does not mention anything about owning land, acquiring land, or securing land. It specifically focuses on caring for the land and elevating Mi'kmaq rights and responsibilities to do that. So in saying that is something else we're doing is developing what we're calling a shared understanding agreement, and that name might change, but it's this idea that the Conservancy might hold the legal title to the land, but it's going to actually be Mi'kmaq communities and Mi'kmaq organizations carrying out the care on the lands. So we're making sure that any parcel that is held by the Conservancy, that there's this agreement in place that specifically outlines who is going to be doing the caring for the land, and then where there are gaps in capacity, that's where the Conservancy will come in, and whether that's simply just funding or if there is training that is needed and things like that, the Conservancy will be there to help facilitate that as well. So I think when we're talking about this, we just have to think that yes, it's a colonial system we're working within, or a Western system we're working within, but there are ways that you can try to incorporate some of these Indigenous values into that. And in saying that, of course, there are going to be lots of other ones that we will incorporate in the future, but that's just a little snippet of what we're working on. I don't know if I answered the question at all, or if I just went on a total tangent.
I think you've nailed it. And Megan, I'll just move a little bit to the south and to the west to Westaquay and New Brunswick. And Patty, do you want to jump at this first?
I think I'd rather have Kelsey to speak to it.
As you will.
Sure. I mean, we don't have a private land trust truly yet. So I don't know if I can answer the question. We have a land holding company, which is not the same. And we haven't really been able to utilize it. So I think that establishing our own land trust, kind of as Megan has spoke to quite well, you didn't go on a tangent, is, it's kind of like this solution that, we have to work in this colonized system and make it work for, the nation. And I think it'll be really interesting as we develop our land trust and go from there and what that looks like. But yeah, I don't think I really have an answer to the question yet.
I love the yet.
So Larry, I will just add onto that then, is that, for the work that we're doing, it is meant for it to be community-led, Indigenous-led. And so, and I think what Kelsey is alluding to is the fact that we are still developing. A lot of this is still just, many discussions that need to be held with our communities. And it's been difficult, honestly, with the pandemic, to get the kind of community engagement that we are typically striving for in order to make these initiatives meaningful and impactful. So, in all honesty, we need some more time to develop these ideas. And, for myself, I'm really probably not interested in indigenizing a broken status quo system. I'm going to be looking to, seeing creativity and innovation and, using the best tools that we have in order to approach this. And, that's not a comment on what anybody else is doing. It's just that, as indicated, the language that you're using is key. And to me, we cannot capture this type of work in the English language, with all due respect. We need to have our own language that is being applied and as the key concepts that would underline that kind of development. And just on that point, I did want to raise the fact that, across the globe, and particularly across Turtle Island, that there has been research, there has been study that supports the findings that where Indigenous-led conservation and stewardship is taking place, that is where you find the best level of retention for biodiversity. And knowing what a climate crisis that we are in, this is critically important. So private, not private, whatever, we're still all on the same planet, and we need to be understanding the best ways that we can retain our biodiversity. And therein lies a key, which is Indigenous languages, which we haven't mentioned, is that Indigenous languages are key to retaining and preserving and maintaining biological biodiversity. And so I just want to highlight that point, just so that it doesn't get lost in this English discussion of what it is that is important in our Indigenous-led approach.
Thanks, Patty. I think those are really important messages, and it's certainly in the Great Lakes area where I'm more active and in conversation, I hear that very strongly from Indigenous nations about what language we use, what concepts we're using, and how to reclaim some of those, and to do it in the Indigenous languages, which are so connected to the land. So miigwech for that, and Kelsey also for the questions and the exploration, and I really appreciate Megan's experience with the start of the Conservancy, and the attention that community has paid to how to make that, as in, while it's a Western colonial concept, the corporations and some of the tax laws, how to bend that and apply it as a tool, as you said, Megan, for the purposes of the Mi'kmaq people, and to shape that. I'm thinking, Nathan, some of the solutions to some of these questions. How can private landowners support Indigenous conservation leadership? How can we look at those who are perhaps non-Indigenous, many folks who are caring for lands and want to care for that more thoroughly and in partnership, in relation, more fulsome relationship with the Indigenous communities of which that land is a part. So perhaps you can speak to your land trust experience on that front in working with landowners in that regard.
Yeah, thanks, Ian, and just really appreciate Patty's points there as well too, and the fact that there are, I think, a bundle of approaches and solutions and opportunities to go forward. And I think really what is critical is ensuring that Indigenous leadership is, has the decision-making authority to determine what works best for them. And I think that's really kind of fundamental when we think about those opportunities as well that private landowners and others can have when thinking about how do they support Indigenous nations and how do they contribute to those fulfilling those responsibilities when it comes to questions around private land. And I think there's lots of opportunities there, and think about land back, I think, is really an important opportunity to reorient again how we approach these ideas about private land and conservation. And I think can really help shift those narratives or assumptions that we make about landscapes. Again, that idea, that assumption that people aren't part of the land, and that how do we shift that narrative? And I think land back provides some of those real opportunities there too. So I think for organizations like NCC and landowners too, and kind of the context within we're all working, we're really at kind of the start of that journey and really starting to kind of stumble through some of those early steps, and what are those kind of colonial tools that can be used to help do this while creating space for those new tools, or I think the resurgence of Indigenous tools to be able to do this work as well. I think fundamental, what is really important for private landowners to do is just kind of educate themselves about histories and commit to building better relationships. And I think, Patty, you talked about too, those challenges of climate change and biodiversity loss really will require all of us to do better. And being a better neighbor starts with that, and just taking time to learn about your neighbors and their histories and their connections to the land, and how you as a landowner, there's a very varying degree of what we call a landowner, from someone that rents a condo or owns some portion of one of those rights, to people that have massive ranches. And we have opportunities to in any of those forms to educate ourselves and do better. I think there's really good opportunities in certain portions of the province as well to think about the lands that they may, I think, quote unquote, own through owning kind of those fee simple bundles of rights. That how do we think differently about things like access, for instance, or being able to support nations in engaging in culture defining activities. And I think organizations like the Treaty Land Sharing Network in Saskatchewan is an example of how landowners may be able to think differently about supporting nations and engaging in those activities on private land in a way that hopefully helps to break down some of those things around jurisdiction that John was talking about earlier. I think that are really, really important that we can kind of take and think differently about that. I think other steps as well too are just like actually literally returning land that they have to back to Indigenous nations as well too. And I'm sure Patty, Megan, and Kelsey and others will also, and you, Ian, as well too, and Larry, realize that it's sometimes not that simple, and that there's actually the colonial state has done such a good job through centuries of oppression and systemic racism and the Indian Act and everything to build up, I think, these particular challenges we find ourselves in. So whether that's, transferring land ownership to nations, like the requirement to sometimes create organizations that can hold land. And so we do ourselves, I think, a disservice there. And so now we're trying to think about what are ways to kind of change that. And sometimes intermediaries or allies like NCC can play a role in working through that kind of those tax laws, those charity laws, connecting with those Indigenous nations to kind of help facilitate some of that process. I think that's something, I think we can help to break down. I think the other thing that I find that we often get faced with is those ideas about oppression and systemic racism that has built up the fear and mistrust. I think that Patty and others have spoken to as well, and the real need to kind of break that down. And as you were speaking out, Patty, a moment ago too, that Indigenous knowledge and systems of governments have proven effective globally in terms of maintaining healthy, I think, human and non-human relations with the land. And that through educating ourselves about that, I think, is really, really critical step for breaking down that fear and mistrust, and realizing that having trust and giving up control will actually lead to better enduring conservation. So I think those ideas about education and then working to transfer land, I think, are really, really important things. And then thinking differently about how we can support the responsibilities and rights that nations have on the lands that we may manage. And organizations like NCC are quite happy to help that and help make those connections to those nations that hold those rights and responsibilities.
think those are all excellent points, Nathan, and connecting the dots between some of the practical steps that progressive land trusts, private landholders are taking now to recognize history, to begin to work through the tangle of, in some cases, centuries of colonial structure that has led us to understand certain lands as being private in the context of an understanding that that is really just a legal story that we told ourselves for 150 years, and it comes from a different place. One of the things that occurs to me as a legal scholar is that our very idea of private land is in many ways a fiction. It derives from the idea that there was a king, that king had a direct line to God, and that king could grant you rights against the rest of the world, but not against the king or God when it comes to the use and disposal, and in some cases destruction, of private lands. So that history, which comes very much from a different time and a different place, was imported into Canada's common and civil law. And we find ourselves now in this thicket where hundreds of years of legal overgrowth from these concepts needs to be cleared away to make clear, to reveal some of the basic truths that John Burroughs opened up this webinar with, that ultimately none of us really own land if we can't take it with us. We have it for a time, and we have it in relationship, both to others in our community. Now we're beginning to think about that more inclusively, and to the earth itself, because as any modern event over the last few weeks will show us, there are many other forces that don't actually give a whit about what our laws say, that are much more fundamental to how the earth as an ecosystem operates, and has we as creatures that use energy and occupy space within that ecosystem continue to persist. So thinking in those more global and planetary terms, as well as in our moment of history, where it's possible for the first time to begin to talk about our relationships to each other, is then the start of a conversation to think about our relationships with Earth. And the idea of trust, which is one of those few old English law traditions that actually imposes duties on the person holding that trust, the owner, if you will, of those trust obligations, to do something for others, as opposed to do something for themselves. And this is where I think it's a useful opening. It's a space that hasn't been explored to the same degree as simple private land transitions of fee simple ownership from party A to party B. And how does that begin to open up space for restoring these kinds of relationships that you've all described? So this is maybe something that I'll toss back to the group, not so much as between private landowners and Indigenous governments, but how do other Canadian institutions participate in this conversation? What are the roles and responsibilities, say, of municipalities that are often directly involved in the management of private lands, in particular locales? Where do those entities fit, and how do we begin to engage that broader conversation? So perhaps back to you, Nathan, maybe to respond, and then we'll go around the circle.
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Larry. I think, I, again, would respect the leadership and the perspectives from folks like Patty and Kelsey and Megan that are kind of working there. I think, from my perspective, I was mentioning earlier too, that there's just so many challenges we all face, and we all bring particular skill sets, knowledge, energy to this space with different ideas that are all needed. And we can think about the different opportunities we have and the responsibilities that we all carry to a collective future and a future kind of well-being. And I think that's why I think about that idea of that trust you were talking about, that we all have trustees to take care and do something for others to some degree, and whether that's the other being Mother Earth, or the others being nations with rights and responsibilities there, or others that also have connections to that land, and settlers and stakeholders and others. So I think we all have a role to play there, and trying to figure out what is that role that we do have. How do we bring those capacities and skills and abilities forward to think about doing things better? So I would agree that Crown organizations, whether they're provincial or federal, have a role to play there, and they bring tools and abilities that can help enable some of these actions. And I think there's voices that stakeholders and allies and other organizations that can, I think, help to identify maybe some of those barriers are, and bring that forward. And then I think, as you talking about, municipal governments as well too have a role to play there. I think oftentimes we fight, or there's conflict all the time about sometimes who's right or who's wrong, or we work in these colonial systems. And we talk about these challenges that we all face that can be so complex. And oftentimes I think we can all see where we're wanting to get to, and we can all see this unifying future that we all need. So can we focus on that and figure out what our responsibility is, or kind of, as you're talking, Larry, the kind of the trustee relation that we have to that future, and how do we all collectively work together to, I think, build that full picture that we all need to and want to see. So it's not, I'm not necessarily about fighting about what we need to do or our priorities, but what are the priorities that we are seeking to achieve, and how best do we support those priorities kind of going forward, and what roles do we have to play? And I think whether those are soft skills or hard skills, or acts or legislation that we have, but I think thinking about it as of the responsibilities that we have, I think is a really important way to be able to take the tools that we have to leverage that better future. So, it's kind of a wishy-washy answer maybe, but I think that's kind of where I head, is how do we all contribute collectively?
Masi, Nathan, to our other panelists.
Yeah, I would just like to say that municipalities have a huge role, given the fact that many municipalities across Turtle Island are sacred sites, are burial sites, are sites that, contain our artifacts, our, history, our heritage, and essentially have created their city over and beside and on top of many things that we hold sacred. And so to me, I would encourage municipalities to seek out a better relationship, a stronger relationship with the communities that are, adjacent and not always adjacent, but, within a territory of the nations that, Indigenous nations that are there, because that work is very important. We've had some of our elders from across this country try to explain and describe just how much our history of the land is not reflected on the land anymore. And that a lot of our sacred places, a lot of our gathering places, all of which many times are place names that we've kept in our language that are no longer recognized or no longer understood. And so I would suggest that municipalities have a very unique role to begin to look at the truth and begin the reconciliation around that. And the other thing I wanted to say also is that when we started our work on IPCAs, we looked at conservation, and conservation in and of itself can be very limiting. We all know there's definitions, there's standards, etc., that have been set out primarily in the non-Indigenous language around what constitutes conservation. For our purposes, for the purposes of our work, we said conservation is going to include not only physical conservation, it's going to include emotional conservation, mental conservation, and spiritual conservation, so that no matter the level of conservation that we are doing, we are going to remain the stewards of all of those levels of conservation. So even if we continue to be dispossessed and denied, as we currently are within our own territory, we can maintain cultural conservation, spiritual conservation, emotional conservation, which ties us to our lands regardless of who claims to own it. Because for us, no matter the circumstance, private, public, fee simple, etc., we are still responsible for taking care of that land however we can. We are put here to be good ancestors, and that's what we intend our work to do.
I want Patty. Kelsey or Megan?
Yeah, what Patty said, all of what she said, especially when it comes to the question of municipalities, and it's complex again, because they're not, you know, the province or the feds, but they have a much more intimate connection and, you know, responsibility to communities. I think I heard Chief Alan Polchis of St. Mary's First Nation, where I am. He was talking to the mayor of Fredericton, and he said, "Oh, Fredericton, a suburb of St. Mary's," and it's true. And it's, you know, I would say their responsibility is higher. They need to do more, and it's, again, it's complicated, kind of like it is with private land trusts. And, you know, they buy private land, but they're a city, and so it's kind of, they're buying it for their citizens. But it's, again, there's tons of jurisdictional issues, but I think it is really important to bring them into this conversation, for sure.
Yeah, and I guess I can just add on a little bit. And first, I'll just say, Patty, that was so beautifully put, and it's such a grounding way to think about it, that it's not just, we're not talking just about the land, but all the facets that kind of feed into that, the culture and the language and the mental aspect of it. And that's just such a fantastic thing. So thank you for sharing that. And just say, I wanted to kind of go off, Nathan, what you were saying. It really, and I think kind of what you were saying as well, is it's the whole idea that municipalities and all levels of government, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, need to be coming to the table and speaking in an ethical space. And like, that's something that's talked a lot about in the ICE report in terms of Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and this idea of ethical space. I think that's really important, especially when thinking about all the different levels of government. And I guess I can just speak really quickly to potential even littler aspects that we have seen in our work of ways that municipalities and provincial and federal government can actually start to work towards this relationship and start to actually help to elevate Indigenous rights and responsibilities for land conservation. And just one example being something that we're facing right now with municipalities. And again, this goes back to that whole private land. It's the idea of property taxes. That if you can't own, you shouldn't, land is not there to be owned. You shouldn't have to pay property taxes on land. Like, it is just really a backwards system. So one thing municipalities could do, and this is a very specific example, what would actually be to waive those property taxes on lands that are being cared for by Indigenous nations. It is actually, at least in Nova Scotia, it's a municipal, that area falls under the municipal jurisdiction. So it's a very simple thing that municipalities could do to try and help move this relationship forward and start to really understand and contribute to Indigenous-led conservation. So just one example of that we've actually run into, that someplace that municipalities could really help with.
I might add a few things around some examples where municipalities are doing some really interesting things here in Ontario. And we've seen where provincial direction has come to have more fulsome consultation during planning matters between municipalities and Indigenous nations in the traditional territories. We've seen, I think the Williams Treaty First Nations have sued the province around some zoning orders, provincial zoning orders, and the premier has come out and said, well, before you come and ask for zoning orders, you better have had good consultation with the local Indigenous communities. And so we're seeing a shift in some of the provincial directives. We're seeing municipalities picking up on that. For example, here in the city of Peterborough, they just passed their main direction, their official plan that includes reference to free, prior, and informed consent, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, with close collaboration and input from local Mississauga First Nations. And we're seeing sort of peace and friendship accords and the tourism agency looking at a pledge of community members to engage and learn, and also other communities that are looking for shared governance and exploring how that can happen. So there are examples out there, I think, many roles, and I appreciate, Megan, that's a really good point about the property taxes. There's some really important opportunities to work with land trusts and Indigenous nations that are caring for lands, looking at incorporating them into reserves over time or otherwise. So some really creative approaches. I think, Patty, that's what you're suggesting. Let's not just indigenize these things, but let's have a hard look at it, and let's be creative and find that new space, that ethical space, that learning space. And I know Nathan and I have had the chance to work with some law students at Osgoode Hall Law School at York University, and they're doing some research about where some of these laws lead us to dead ends or they don't match up, and where there's opportunities for changes. So while that's within the colonial system, there are opportunities and people willing to explore that from many different dimensions to bring those skills and experiences to the table.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks to all the panelists for their contributions on that last round of questions. I think the key takeaway for me, at least, is that as we approach this issue from wherever we're situated, whether we're private landowners looking to do the right thing with land that somehow ended up ours, or municipalities that are tasked with maintaining and providing services in local areas, collecting property taxes, ensuring that there's public amenity, or land trusts and other not-for-profit organizations occupying a space that is largely structured by tax and other incentives that have been created to encourage conservation, at least in the sense of setting aside some lands for future generations. How we approach these issues as ultimately private citizens or as folks working in less than national government contexts is really empowering. I think so many of these issues get kicked up to these are matters of constitutional law that only the prime minister and the national chief can figure out. If there's anything that this conversation, and certainly the research that we've done in this area, has made clear, is that that is the farthest thing from the case. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommended that as one of their calls to action, that all Canadians take steps to understand the fallacies that are inherent in the doctrine of discovery, or the idea of terra nullius, that land was empty and could be taken up and put into these private land property systems as a matter of law. We know that's not true. We're trying now as a nation, as legal practitioners, as governments of all different types, to figure out how to move forward. but the opportunities and indeed the ethical obligations on private citizens to move in a good way in these spaces themselves is so obvious. And that's something that I think this panel has really brought out. So just ask commitment for that. There are a few more questions in the chat, and I'm just going to pick one here, which I think is important. And it's a topic that we addressed in our report, which is Canadian law has largely framed the question of Section 35 rights, Aboriginal rights as they're understood in a constitutional sense, in terms of Crown duties and obligations to consult and accommodate and to uphold this idea of the honor of the Crown. How is that different from the idea of seeking consent? And how should this then apply in a private land, private transaction context? So maybe I'll turn that over to our panelists, starting with Patty.
So I don't purport to be any kind of a, I guess, legal technician, but I would say help me help you is really how we're approaching this work, because of the fact that there is such an opportunity, there is such optimism and hopefulness in this work, in that if you and I can get it right, and we start there, it's literally like that ripple effect of the pebble in the pond, and that's the wave we want to create. That's the wave we want to see spread around the globe, instead of this other wave that we're dealing with. Because in many ways, that is that spectrum that John referred to. We're either over here, doing what we need to do to be good ancestors, or we're over here hanging on, trying to keep it going. And I don't know about you, but I prefer this other end than this end. And if we can meet somewhere in that middle to get to a better place, a healthier place, that is what I'm interested in. And I think that is what a lot of people are interested in. So let's figure it out. Let's talk it out. Let's just get into the messiness of all of this business and make it so that our kids and your kids and everybody's kids are going to have a better place to live.
Thanks, Patty. And there's a great follow-up that I think I suspect I know the answer to, but I'm going to ask the question, which is, would a formal Section 35 consultation be the right way to start such a conversation, or is there a better way? And I'll let one of either yourself or another panelist pick up on that.
Just kind of, maybe reflecting on that one, Larry, just kind of go back to what Patty was talking about, and like to completely agree with her. And I find oftentimes if we talk about consent, consult, I always think about it as like the word sustainability, and that we all maybe have a perspective on what those terms mean, and they can be radically different. And I remember working in fisheries and working with nations that were looking to manage their salmon stocks. We're like, well, we think this is what the government is telling us is sustainable, isn't sustainable. And the government, we're like, well, we think it's totally sustainable. It meets our maximum sustained yield and this, that, and the other. And talking, as Patty was talking about the cultural importance of these things too, were never taken into consideration. So I think in my mind, consult and consultation kind of like that. And I feel sometimes if we focus on the word consultation, it's kind of a race to the bottom, that it's about what is the minimum requirement that we need to do here, and we can argue this, that, and the other, and that's not what we should be aspiring to. And as NCC, I think what we're looking to is what Patty was talking about, is we want to be able to listen, learn, and be able to engage and build those meaningful relationships that contributes to the future that we all want to see, and that we want to see for our children and our children's children. And those conversations aren't necessarily always easy, and they're not always difficult. And thinking about that spectrum that Patty and John were speaking to as well. But through those conversations, we'll figure out together what we think is needed to kind of go forward, and how do we work together in this landscape, whether it's private land conservation or other types of approaches, or thinking about culture, and through the dialogue and the listening and figuring out how do we, coming from that place of support, and how do we kind of leverage those abilities to support nations in achieving their conservation vision. I think that's in that dialogue is where we'll arrive at a common understanding. And I think oftentimes that's where we run into challenges, that we may have one understanding of what the idea of conservation is or consultation is, and they're not shared. And so through that dialogue, we can learn, and we can build that bridge for that better future. So it's where I kind of go, as opposed to thinking about Section 35.
Thanks, Ian. Other panelists who want to speak on that question? Hearing none.
I would just jump in to say that, however we get there, we just need to get there. If demanding a consultation and that utilizing that process helps get us there, then so be it. However, I would like to think that there is enough of us that want to get there because we know we need to, regardless of any other impetus. Then we are loving, caring people on this planet. That is why we do that work, and need to do our work collaboratively, but more so cooperatively.
Thanks, Patty. And I think that this is where the idea of modeling the behavior that you're hoping to see in others becomes so important. Having structured the conversation through a legal lens, the kinds of behaviors that we've seen from both Crown and Indigenous governments in that forum over the years have been very much marked by how we differ, where the conflict is, what the issue is that needs to be solved, not from the perspective of creating space for a solution, but getting to a legally determinable answer. And that's very much what courts are for. The conversation that we've had, beginning with John's opening, which was very much a call to think about the language that we are using, about ideas of jurisdiction, law, speaking, and who's talking, as a way of then changing what that conversation is about. Law spoken in Old English terms is going to produce systems that largely look like Old English solutions. Law spoken in a contemporary context in what is now Canada would necessarily be more diverse. It would be French, English, Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Innu, Algonquin, Cree, and I could go on for a very long time, enumerating all of the languages and all of the legal orders that need to be part of that solution. And that complexity can be frightening, but it's also a form of diversity in the sense that each one of these languages, each one of these solutions, has grown up in a particular relationship with Earth and with environment, where there are both words, lessons, and laws that speak to how we should live in those places in a good way. And perhaps one of our biggest challenges has been, first and foremost, that many of us have never listened, but also we don't know how to begin the conversation. And so this is perhaps the last question that I'll turn over to the panel, which is to simply say as a advice to participants, how to begin those conversations in terms of where they are situated. You know, as Indigenous practitioners, as not-for-profit representatives, or as others, you know, where do you start? So perhaps, Ian, I'll kick this over to you first to respond, and then we'll go around the circle.
Thanks, Larry. One of the things that we spent some time with in our paper was looking at some of the best practices that looked at relationships, looked at building respect, the trust that starts from those local conversations as neighbors, as Patty said, people who care for this earth, for this place. And regardless of our histories, we're bringing diversity of experiences and skill sets to that conversation. And there are land trust standards and practices that recognize that there has been a limited exploration of what it requires of land trusts and particularly non-Indigenous organizations to engage with the holders of that knowledge, that tradition, that territory, that care in those languages. And so one of the things that encourages me is emerging conversations about how those practices and standards might evolve and shift and be part of that wider conversation as well. I also think of the individual discussions that are happening around conservation easements and covenants, where these are a particular legal tool in an English legal tradition, but to open those up to recognize Indigenous legal orders and approaches and concepts and access in ways that haven't traditionally been considered. And so I think to take creative approaches to some of these tools, to have those local experiences, and then we'll create a diversity of experiences and organizations and examples that we can draw from to enrich our conversations. And this is what this conversation today is really doing for me. And I hope for all participants and the other conversations that are being sponsored and perhaps assisted in some ways by the paper that we put together and the partnerships that are coming out of these conversations. So I'll leave it at that for me, but maybe I might pass that on to Kelsey. Kelsey, some thoughts and maybe some of the courageous journeys that you're on. Oh,
I'm not on a courageous journey. So I'm a settler in the unceded and unsurrendered Willistic territory. I was born and raised here, and I'm lucky to live here, and I don't think I'm being brave in my work. But I think, you know, when we're talking about how to maybe approach Indigenous nations or, you know, how to start these conversations, one of the things, I work really closely with the 6 communities consultation coordinators, and I think Russ is here, but Russ always says, when we get engagement questions, usually from like the federal government, because they really like to generalize things, is that you need to recognize that there is no one size fits all answer. All communities, all nations are different. You know, when people say, how do I approach an Indigenous community? Which one? Where are you? What's the treaty? What are their traditions? Do you know anybody? So I think that that's super, super important to start. And I think the other really important way to begin conversations is to begin them as early as possible, as soon as the thought pops in your head. And, you know, don't be afraid to come to the table and say, we want to do something. We don't know what it looks like. We genuinely want to collaborate. We genuinely want you in from the beginning, and we're open. And I think that, you know, and this is getting maybe a little bit too detailed, but in this time and era of reconciliation, you know, we're past, you know, place names. That's a great way to start, but we're past just doing things like that. Co-management and co-governance need to be what you're starting with. Land back needs to be your end goal, because land is such a, I mean, I think it's the center of what reconciliation needs to be about. And again, not ownership, but understanding, you know, what stolen land has done to nations. But I mean, I'll let others answer, but I think for me, like, it's really easy for us to tell when an organization is approaching us and being genuine in wanting to do something right. And I think that that really matters too, is the intent and the relationship building, for sure.
I think that's such a great point, Kelsey, is that it's the being genuine, not just doing it to tick a box or because you have to, but actually because you care and want to be at that table. And I also think it's important that, and I never say this quite how, in a very nice way, but that you aren't putting the burden on the communities or Indigenous communities, is acknowledge that they already have limited capacity to do all of these things. They're in a failing system. So if you're going to the table and asking things of them, realizing that they might not be able to give you what you're looking for, and it's your responsibility to do that. And it's your responsibility to help build capacity. And just making sure that, like, you're not coming to the table and expecting everything from them and not giving anything back. That's something that within Confederacy Mainland Mi'kmaq happens a lot as well, of organizations, even well-intended organizations, just coming and asking for things and not assisting or giving anything back in return. It's not sustainable, right? Like, the capacity just isn't there. So that's really important as well. And in saying that, we've also some organizations that are fantastic. They'll come to us and be like, hey, we've already developed this. Look at it, see what you think. If you want to be involved, we would love to have you there, but we understand that if this just doesn't fit within what you're currently working on, that's absolutely okay. We'll stay in touch. And that can be really helpful too. It's like you said, just starting those conversations early. Maybe they aren't going to go right where you expect or where the other person expects, but at least having them so that the foundation is there, those relationships are being developed, and you never know what's going to come out of them.
I think Megan and Kelsey really raised some really good points. And I think there's just lots of, I think, lessons learned over the years about that, and thinking about time differently, thinking about what does successful engagement look like and stuff like that. Now, I just think, I get that question lots from staff and NCC too, like, well, how do I engage? And I just don't know where to start. And there's lots of really good kind of comments and questions in the chat that kind of reflect on that too. And I often, my own experience is just tell folks, like, sometimes the easiest thing in the world to do is have a cup of coffee with someone. It's just another human talking to another human. And sometimes the hardest thing in the world to do is have a cup of coffee with someone, because we put so much consideration, or, we read so much into that. And oftentimes I think there's guilt or there's shame in the work, or, we're worried about the way it's going to react, or I'm going to say something wrong, and we tie ourselves in knots and we don't do anything. And oftentimes what that discomfort leads to inaction. And I think what we should realize is that, as a conservation organization or someone that's supporting Indigenous communities, you're probably going to get it wrong, and that's okay. And and I think it's important to try to do our best, and then to listen and learn and reframe and do better, and continue to do better. And I think that is really, really important, and that we all need to start. And there's lots of advice and speaking with Indigenous nations and hearing from folks like Kelsey, Megan, and others about what does effective engagement look like from them, and then taking those lessons and acting on that, I think, is really, really important. But don't let that, that fear, I think, of saying something wrong, or that fear of stepping on your tongue or putting your foot in your mouth, stop you from doing that engagement. And that some of the best ways we can learn is by doing something wrong and then doing better next time. So that's kind of where I think about too. And there's lots of, again, tips and tricks on how to do that. But the first, that just take that step is really, really important.
Patty, would you like to add a few thoughts on that thread?
Well, just quickly, I would just say that have an openness and a willingness, and try to keep mindful of the fact that, you know, this relationship has been, I would say, misdeveloped over hundreds of years, and that there is a lot of baggage, there's a lot of stereotypes, there's a lot of bias and assumptions that, you know, are embedded in the system and historically have led us to this inability to speak to each other. And so that is a lot to deal with. And it's something that in any communication, the speaker and the listener will need to work at. So it's not going to be an overnight, hey, I need your name on our proposal kind of exchange. It has to be something that folks are committed to, are willing to undergo change, and a lot of people are afraid of change. And it brings me back to this idea of when South Africa moved out of its apartheid system, the system that they actually took from Canada and used in their legislation, that when they were moving out of apartheid, because in Canada we have apartheid, just so it's clear to folks, that when South Africa was moving out of that the government repeatedly stoked fear, repeatedly stoked conflict, and this supposed inability for any other solution to exist. And so if folks in Canada need to understand about moving away from an apartheid system, I would suggest looking at some of that documentation, as well as about 30 years ago, there was something called the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. There's 5 volumes. Read those cover to cover in order to get a sense of the level of issues that many of us are dealing with, as well as Larry has mentioned, the TRC, another extensive report, and the MMIWG inquiry report. Read those reports, read the recommendations, begin to understand and glean how this work is all interconnected, because it is. And it's not on my shoulders, and it's probably not on yours, but together we all have to bear this responsibility of learning what has happened on our lands and waters, so that we can begin to do the reconciliation that is needed across our country.
I think that stands as the final word in what's been a truly amazing webinar that all of you and all of our participants who've posed questions or have just been here listening to this dialogue have been a part of today. And certainly this is the purpose of the Conservationist Reconciliation Partnership, is to weave these threads together and to confront some of these hard truths about how conservation has been practiced, some of the opportunities and some of the obstacles that exist on our way to what is not just inherently a better place, a more just, fair, and appropriate set of relationships between all of our communities and the earth, but more fundamentally dismantling some of the systems that drive us apart, that create these challenges, and that have led to such historical and present injustice. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Patty for a closing. There's information on the CRP website. All of you are invited to our next virtual campfire. And with that, Patty, please bring us to a close.
So Waliwin, thank you all very much for taking part in this today. Typically, when we're doing our closing, we acknowledge all of your families, the places that you've come from, wish you good travels to back to where you come from, and of course, wish you a good journey from here. I would like to close off with a song that comes from our territory. It was actually a song that came to my cousin Gwen Bear, and I am going to attempt to sing it at least a bit for you as our closing. Walla stuck by Malagway, Ajine Bamigo, Walla stuck by Malagway, Supel me Nigos Bamipin. Was is it nil askamil? Need was Bamipin. Was is it nil askamil? Waliwin.
Thanks, Patty.
Jimmy Gwetz.
Just come in.